Smoke still hung over Pearl Harbor when a single question haunted America: would there ever be a strike back? The attack of December 7, 1941 had shaken the nation to its core. Battleships lay broken in the harbor, thousands were dead or wounded, and families across the country lived with grief, anger, and fear. News headlines spoke of loss and shock. People felt exposed for the first time, as if the ocean was no longer a wall of safety. Leaders in Washington knew that morale was collapsing, and without hope, the war would only feel heavier for every American. Historians describe this moment as a turning point, when the nation searched for something that could lift its spirit and prove that defeat was not the final word. Inside the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt wrestled with pressure from all sides. The military was still rebuilding its strength in the Pacific, yet the public needed a sign that the United States could fight back. Commanders debated plans that seemed impossible. Japan was far away. American bombers were not designed to reach its cities. Every option carried danger. But the emotional need was greater than the risk. Roosevelt wanted a strike that would show the enemy, and the American people, that the country was not broken, that courage could rise even in the darkest hour. This search for a bold answer set the stage for a mission unlike anything attempted before. Military planners gathered around maps and charts, trying to solve a problem that seemed impossible. Japan's heartland was thousands of miles across the Pacific. No American base was close enough for land-based bombers, and the aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy carried only smaller fighter planes. Large bombers like the B-25 needed long runways, heavy fuel, and space that ships did not have. Every officer understood the risk. If the United States tried and failed, the loss of men and machines would be painful, and morale could fall even further. But if they did nothing, the enemy would believe America was weak. This pressure shaped every discussion in Washington in early 1942. It was during this difficult search for answers that an unusual idea appeared. U.S. Navy officer Captain Francis S. Lowe suggested something that sounded reckless at first: what if medium bombers could take off from an aircraft carrier? No one had ever done this before in combat. Bombers were large, heavy, and never meant for ship decks. Many leaders doubted it was even possible. Yet the idea stayed on the table because it was the only plan that offered a direct strike on Japan. Tests began in secret, and engineers studied every technical detail to see whether a bomber could lift into the air before the edge of the carrier deck. Officers knew that if this worked, it would not only hit Tokyo, it would prove that America still had the courage to attempt the impossible. A name soon rose to the center of the mission: Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. He was known as a skilled aviator, an engineer, and a daring test pilot who understood both science and risk. When he agreed to lead the operation, he did so with a clear understanding that success was uncertain and survival was not guaranteed. His job was not only to design the mission, but to inspire the men who would fly it. The emotional weight of responsibility rested heavily on him, yet he accepted it because he believed the country needed hope more than anything else. Historians describe Doolittle as calm, disciplined, and driven by duty during these crucial days of planning. Word of a secret mission spread quietly through select U.S. Army Air Forces units. Pilots and crew members were told almost nothing at first. They only knew one thing: this assignment was dangerous, and volunteers were needed. Many of the men stepped forward without hesitation. Some were young and eager to serve, others were older, with families waiting at home. None of them were promised a safe return. They understood that this mission might cost them their lives, yet they still raised their hands. Historians note that the secrecy, uncertainty, and sense of duty created a powerful emotional bond among the men chosen for the operation. Training began at Eglin Field in Florida, where the crews finally learned part of the truth. They would be flying B-25 Mitchell bombers modified to reduce weight and increase fuel capacity. The aircraft were stripped of unnecessary equipment, extra guns were removed, and additional fuel tanks were installed so they could travel farther than normal. Pilots practiced short runway takeoffs again and again, forcing large bombers to leave the ground in a much shorter distance than usual. Every day brought new stress and new determination. The men were not just preparing for a mission, they were preparing for something that had never been attempted in combat before. During these weeks, the emotional weight of the mission became real. Letters were written and sealed. Some men avoided saying goodbye in a dramatic way, choosing instead to act calm so their families would not worry. Others prayed quietly at night, aware that the chances of survival were uncertain. Yet morale inside the unit remained strong. They trusted Doolittle's leadership and believed their effort could lift the spirit of their country. According to historical accounts, many of the volunteers later said that they did not go because they expected glory, they went because someone had to take the first step in striking back. The mission moved from training grounds to the open ocean. In early April 1942, the selected air crews and their B-25 bombers were loaded onto the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. For many of the men, this was the first time they had ever stepped onto a Navy carrier. The flight deck was crowded, and the bombers were tied down tightly, their wings stretching almost to the edges. Sailors and airmen worked side by side, aware that they were part of something unusual and historic. The seas were rough at times, and every wave reminded the crews how fragile their situation was. If the weather turned worse or the enemy discovered them too early, the entire mission could fail before it even began. Life aboard the ship was filled with tension and quiet courage. The airmen practiced emergency drills, checked their aircraft again and again, and reviewed flight plans in small groups. They slept in narrow bunks, listening to the constant sound of engines and ocean wind. Some men joked to keep their spirits calm, while others stayed silent, lost in thought. No one knew exactly what awaited them once they reached Japan. Doolittle moved among the crews, speaking with them in a steady and reassuring manner. His presence gave confidence, but every man still understood the truth: once they took off, there was almost no chance of landing back on the carrier. The plan required them to continue toward China, where survival would depend on luck, weather, and friendly help on the ground. As the task force sailed west across the Pacific, secrecy became more important than ever. The ships traveled under strict radio silence, and lookouts scanned the horizon for Japanese patrol vessels. Each passing mile increased both hope and danger. The men felt pride knowing they were bringing the war to the enemy's doorstep, yet they also felt the weight of every decision made on that deck. Historians describe this journey as a period of intense anticipation, a silent march toward a mission that could change the emotional balance of the war, even if the cost was high. Before dawn on April 18, 1942, the quiet tension on the deck of the USS Hornet turned into sudden urgency. The task force was still hundreds of miles from the planned launch point when lookouts reported Japanese picket boats on the horizon. These patrol vessels had one purpose: to detect enemy fleets and radio warnings back to Japan. The U.S. Navy moved fast to destroy them, but there was fear that at least one message might have been sent. If the Japanese learned of the approaching force, they could launch a counterattack long before the bombers reached their targets. This forced the commanders into a difficult decision: launch the mission early with less fuel and greater danger, or risk losing the element of surprise altogether. The seas were rough, the wind was strong, and the carrier deck was short, far shorter than anything a B-25 bomber was meant to use. The crews gathered near their aircraft as orders spread across the flight deck. They would have to take off immediately, hours earlier than planned, which meant they would be flying a longer distance with tighter fuel margins. Many of the men understood what this meant: their chances of reaching safe landing areas in China would drop sharply. Still, none of them stepped back. They checked their gear, tightened their straps, and prepared themselves for the moment that would define their courage. James H. Doolittle moved from crew to crew, offering a few quiet words before climbing into his own aircraft. Witness accounts describe him as calm and steady, even though he knew the risks better than anyone else. When the first bomber rolled toward the edge of the carrier, every heart on deck seemed to stop for a second. The engines roared, the aircraft rushed forward, and for a brief moment it dipped toward the waves before lifting into the air. Cheers and relief followed: the impossible had just become real. One by one, the remaining bombers followed, lifting off into the stormy sky and vanishing toward Japan, carrying with them the hope of a wounded nation. The bombers flew low over the gray Pacific, their engines steady but their future unknown. Inside each aircraft, the crews sat in silence, focused on their instruments and the endless stretch of ocean beneath them. The early launch meant every mile mattered. Fuel gauges were watched with fear, and every gust of wind felt like a reminder of how fragile their chances were. Some men thought of home. Others whispered short prayers. They all knew there was no turning back now. The mission was no longer an idea, it was a living moment, carried forward on wings that had never been meant to fly this far. The hours in the air were long and heavy. The weather shifted from clouds to rain and back again. Icy winds cut through the thin metal skin of the bombers, and the crews struggled against fatigue. Communication between planes was limited, so each aircraft felt alone in the vast sky, guided only by navigation skills and trust. The pilots stayed focused, adjusting course, checking bearings, fighting fear with discipline. Every man inside those bombers understood that one mistake could send them into the sea. Yet they kept flying, because the meaning of their mission was larger than their own lives. As Japan's coastline slowly came into view, a wave of emotion passed through the crews. Relief mixed with tension. They had made it this far, but the most dangerous part was still ahead. Below them was the heart of an enemy nation that believed its cities were untouchable. The men tightened their grips, prepared their bombs, and steadied their thoughts. They were thousands of miles from safety, surrounded by risk, yet driven by a single, shared purpose, to show that America could rise again after its darkest day. The first B-25s crossed over the Japanese mainland in the early morning haze. From thousands of feet above, the city sprawled beneath them, a mix of rooftops, streets, and hidden military installations. For the crews, the sight was surreal, beauty intertwined with the knowledge that bombs in their hands could cause destruction and change lives forever. Each man felt a mixture of fear, determination, and a strange clarity. This was the moment they had trained for, the moment America's response to Pearl Harbor would be felt. Anti-aircraft fire erupted almost immediately. Flak shells burst in bright clouds of smoke around the bombers, rocking them with every blast. Pilots gritted their teeth and gripped the controls, while gunners aimed carefully, firing back at the invisible threat. The roar of the engines, the smell of fuel, and the tension in the air pressed on every man's nerves. Yet they pressed forward, steady and relentless, knowing the mission depended on courage and precision. Bombs fell over military targets and key industrial sites. The explosions were shocking, the smoke rising into the sky like black banners of defiance. Some of the crews caught glimpses of terrified civilians below, and for a moment, humanity mingled with the chaos of war. Every second was a test of nerve. One wrong move, and they could crash into the city, into the sea, or fail to reach the safety of China. But against all odds, the raid moved forward, and the impossible act of hitting Tokyo from the air was becoming real. As the bombers turned away from Tokyo, the danger was far from over. Japanese fighter planes now appeared on the horizon, slicing through clouds with deadly speed. The raiders faced a terrifying choice: fight or keep pressing toward their fragile chance at escape. Inside the cockpits, hearts pounded, and hands gripped controls tighter than ever. Gunners fired in bursts, engines screamed, and the air seemed alive with tension. Every man understood the cost: one miscalculation could mean death for the entire crew. Yet in the midst of chaos, courage shone through. Pilots maneuvered with skill and instinct, gunners stayed steady despite the fear, and co-pilots read instruments with calm precision. Every action was a test of training, nerve, and trust in the team. Moments of doubt flickered, but they were replaced instantly by determination. These were not just military maneuvers, they were acts of human courage in the face of almost certain danger. Amid the flak and fighters, the bombers pressed on toward their pre-planned exit points. Fuel was running low, the distance to safe areas in China was daunting, and yet the crews pushed forward. Each man knew that their survival depended not only on skill but on timing, luck, and the kindness of strangers waiting in the unfamiliar lands ahead. They were far from home, in hostile skies, and carrying the hopes of an entire nation on their shoulders. With Tokyo behind them, the bombers now faced the most uncertain part of their journey. Fuel was dangerously low, engines strained, and the Pacific seemed endless beneath them. The men had done what many thought impossible, they had struck the heart of Japan, but survival was far from guaranteed. Every mile brought anxiety, every cloud, every gust of wind, could spell disaster. As they flew over China, relief mixed with worry. They were nearing friendly territory, yet the landscape was unfamiliar, and Japanese patrols still threatened the skies. Crews scanned the ground below, searching for rivers, roads, or villages where they might find help. Exhaustion weighed heavily, but the men pushed forward, drawing on inner reserves of strength and the knowledge that the mission itself had already changed the war's emotional tide. For some, the journey ended with dramatic landings or crashes into the countryside. Parachutes opened, wheels skidded through mud, and planes were abandoned. The airmen who survived these landings depended on the courage and support of Chinese villagers, who hid them, fed them, and guided them through dangerous terrain. Each small act of kindness became a lifeline. The men had faced the impossible, and now, survival demanded the same bravery, patience, and trust that had carried them through the raid itself. Not all of the raiders made it safely to friendly hands. Some were captured by Japanese forces, facing interrogation, harsh treatment, and the uncertainty of life as prisoners of war. The fear was intense, but so was their determination to hold on to dignity and courage. Even in captivity, the airmen refused to show despair, understanding that their endurance reflected the spirit of the mission and the nation they represented. Inside prison walls, the men endured hunger, harsh conditions, and constant anxiety. Yet they also formed bonds, supporting one another through whispered encouragement and shared stories. Each day was a test of patience, resilience, and willpower. Their bravery was not only in the air above Tokyo, but also in the quiet endurance of survival under relentless pressure. The human spirit, historians note, can shine brightest under the heaviest trials, and the Doolittle Raiders embodied that truth in every moment of their captivity. Meanwhile, news of the raid's success had begun to reach the United States. Even before all the men were accounted for, Americans felt the first surge of hope since Pearl Harbor. Courage, audacity, and sacrifice were now symbols of a country ready to fight back. The captured men became silent heroes, their ordeal adding emotional weight to a mission that had already inspired a nation. Back in the United States, the story of the raid spread quickly, even though many details remained secret. Newspapers hinted at a daring attack on Tokyo, and the American people responded with awe and pride. After months of grief and fear following Pearl Harbor, this small but audacious act gave citizens hope that the nation could fight back. Soldiers in training paused to hear the news, families in living rooms felt a renewed sense of confidence, and leaders in Washington felt the emotional weight of the morale boost they had hoped for. James Doolittle and his men became symbols of courage, determination, and the willingness to face impossible odds. Their action reminded Americans that even in the darkest hours, bravery could ignite hope. Medals were awarded, promotions given, and ceremonies held to honor those who risked everything in the name of country. Yet behind the celebrations lay the sobering truth: some men had been lost, others captured, and every bomber crew had faced unimaginable danger. The story of the raid was both triumphant and tragic, reflecting the dual nature of war itself. The emotional impact of the raid went far beyond military strategy. Citizens felt pride and reassurance that their country was capable of daring, creative action. It reminded the world that America was not defeated, and it signaled to Japan that their cities were vulnerable. In countless homes, letters were written to soldiers, prayers whispered for those still missing, and a quiet determination grew: the war could be fought, and courage could prevail even against overwhelming odds. The Doolittle Raid, while a strategic and emotional victory for the United States, came with severe consequences for those on the ground in China. Japanese forces, furious at the attack, launched brutal reprisals against villages suspected of aiding the raiders, and entire communities were destroyed, civilians were killed, and the landscape of rural China became a dangerous and uncertain place. The airmen who survived the raid were acutely aware of the suffering their mission had unintentionally brought to innocent people. The weight of this reality added another layer of emotional complexity to the mission's legacy. For the raiders themselves, the journey of survival was ongoing. Some evaded capture with the help of Chinese villagers, traveling through forests, rivers, and mountains, constantly alert for enemy patrols. Every step carried fear of discovery, yet also hopes that their mission had not been in vain. These moments highlighted not only the physical challenges of war but the psychological endurance required to keep moving forward in an environment where every mistake could be fatal. Despite these hardships, the Doolittle Raiders' courage and resilience became legendary. Their mission demonstrated that even a small, risky action could have a profound emotional and strategic impact. The world watched as ordinary men became symbols of extraordinary bravery, willing to face death and adversity for the sake of their country and the hope of millions at home. The Doolittle Raid had far-reaching consequences far beyond the immediate attack. In Japan, it shattered the belief that the home islands were untouchable. Military leaders were forced to rethink defensive strategies, diverting resources to protect cities and infrastructure. This unplanned shift weakened Japanese positions elsewhere, ultimately influencing key battles such as Midway. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on the United States was profound. The raid restored confidence to a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Soldiers preparing for combat felt a renewed sense of purpose, citizens at home could believe in American resilience, and leaders gained evidence that bold, unconventional strategies could succeed. This surge of morale reminded everyone that war was not only fought with weapons but with courage, determination, and the belief that impossible goals could be achieved. For the Doolittle Raiders, their actions became a benchmark for heroism. Their names were celebrated, their stories told in hushed awe, and their daring inspired others to take risks in the fight for freedom. The raid became more than a military operation, it became a symbol of hope, defiance, and the human capacity to confront fear with bravery. As the years passed, the story of the Doolittle Raid remained etched in history, not only as a military achievement but as a testament to courage under extreme pressure. The surviving raiders continued their service, some in combat and others in training the next generation of pilots. Their bravery became a standard of inspiration for airmen, soldiers, and civilians alike. Memorials were built, ceremonies held, and the names of those who risked everything were honored. Veterans recounted their experiences in speeches and interviews, sharing the emotional highs and lows, the fear of the unknown, the adrenaline of takeoff, the heartbreak of loss, and the pride in accomplishing the impossible. For many, telling their story was a way to keep alive the memory of those who had been lost and to teach future generations the value of courage, sacrifice, and resilience. The Doolittle Raiders' legacy also highlighted the human side of warfare, ordinary men performing extraordinary acts, facing danger with quiet determination, and carrying the hopes of an entire nation. Their mission became more than a raid, it became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the belief that courage could overcome even the darkest moments. The Doolittle Raid stands today as a symbol of audacity, bravery, and the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds, 16 B-25 bombers, 16 crews, and a mission that many thought impossible had changed the course of the war not by sheer destruction but by the hope and morale it inspired. It proved that even after the worst setbacks, courage and ingenuity could strike fear in the enemy and inspire a nation. The men who flew the mission carried the weight of responsibility, fear, and determination. Some never returned, some endured captivity, yet all had a hand in proving that bold action could shift the emotional and strategic balance of war. Their story reminds us that heroism is not measured only in victories or losses, but in the willingness to act when the odds seem insurmountable. Generations since have remembered the raid not merely as an operation in military history, but as a story of human resilience. In classrooms, books, and documentaries, the Doolittle Raiders are celebrated for daring to fly into the unknown, facing fear with resolve, and lifting an entire nation's spirit in a moment when it was needed most. Their courage continues to inspire, proving that even in dark times, hope, determination, and audacity can prevail.